film from Turkey in early September. These were the first pictures the world saw of the latest earthquake disaster in the country's southeastern region, an area where earthquakes are sadly far from rare. The first figures of casualties proved far too low. When the rubble in the affected zone had been cleared, over 2,300 people were found dead, with more than another 3,000 injured. On top of the human losses, damage to property was enormous, with houses being wrecked over a wide area. Devastation was almost total, with scarcely a house left standing and the whole of the economy disrupted. The latest quake had its epicenter at the town of Lice in Diyarbakir province and affected mountain villages for miles around. The dead were further grisly statistics to add to Turkey's toll from quakes this century. According to official government estimates, at least 30,000 people have lost their homes in Lice and the nearby mountain villages as a result of the quake, and the buildings that remain are still being shaken by minor earth tremors, a process likely to continue for up to 3 months. To meet the immediate problems of searching for survivors and the dead, the government sent in 2,000 soldiers to help the Turkish Red Crescent and the townspeople who've remained to see what can be done. The process of relief work is slow and dangerous. Each collapsed building has to be searched for anyone who might still be living, as well as the dead, and already there have been narrow escapes for rescue workers as fresh tremors cause more collapses. The quake has taken lives in almost every family in the area, and the casualties have been highest amongst the women and children, since the quake came during the day when most of the men were at work in the fields. The first bodies were brought out by the townspeople themselves, but the area is now the focus of a massive government relief operation. The problems of communication are enormous, with bad roads and only one telephone in the whole town. But supplies are now being brought in from all over Turkey. Army bulldozers are helping to search the rubble, though after a week or so following the quake, it was clear that no one else would be found alive. The grief, though, for the relatives remains the same. The government announced plans to rebuild the whole town at a cost of more than $33 million. And to help the survivors, it's waived all repayments due on farming loans. Scenes like this are by no means a rare occurrence in Turkey, which is one of the most earthquake-prone areas in the world. At least 50 major earthquakes have taken place since the beginning of this century alone, killing more than 50,000 people. This was the scene at the quake in the Varto region, not far from Lice, in August 1966. During that quake, more than 2,300 people were killed, thousands more were injured, and about 100,000 people were left homeless right across eastern Turkey. More than 200 mothers and children were killed in the Varto cinema, which was showing a children's program at the time. The town of Lice in Manisa province was near the epicenter of another large quake in March 1969. By Turkish standards, the Alasahir quake didn't qualify as a major disaster, since less than 100 people were killed and only 2,500 homes were destroyed. Even so, it created for the government the same problems as any other quake: immediate relief work, the building of new homes, and a continual drain on the nation's overstretched medical services. A year after the Alasahir quake, at the end of March 1970, a whole series of major quakes devastated the Gediz region, this time in western Turkey. The town of Gediz itself was reduced to rubble, and most of those houses which remained standing were so damaged they had to be destroyed. In the mountains around, dozens of smaller towns and villages were also destroyed, and the first major shock was followed by several days of further quakes. About 100,000 people lost their homes, and more than 3,000 were killed. For the government, faced with all the usual problems of an underdeveloped country, the search for international relief for the victims and rebuilding the towns seemed to have become an almost annual affair. More scenes of tragedy once again in the east. The town of Bingöl was leveled by 3 days of major earthquakes in May 1971, only a few weeks after another quake had caused severe casualties in the Burdur region, down near the Syrian border. At least 1,000 people were killed in the Bingöl quakes, though according to some officials, some villagers buried their dead without telling the authorities, so the total figure could have been considerably higher. In Bingöl itself, 80% of the town was destroyed, and once again, thousands of people were left homeless throughout the region, even though a massive program of international aid, coordinated by the government, brought in tents and relief supplies for those who had managed to escape unharmed. Nearly 1,000 people were treated for injuries in the hastily erected field hospitals. The carnage caused by the earthquakes and the human suffering has become almost a way of life for much of Turkey's population. The sturdy mountain people have learned to live with not only their poverty and the extremes of temperature on the Anatolian plateau, but also to expect their houses to fall around them at almost any moment, killing themselves or their families. It seems as though there's little that can be done to remove the cause of the almost inevitable and frequent social disruption. Instead, the government must hold itself ready at any moment to launch a massive emergency relief operation to provide assistance for those who've been affected by the quakes. International relief agencies and foreign governments also need to be always ready. In the past few years, Turkey's received help from the United Nations, the Red Cross, other specialized agencies, and from governments ranging from Japan and Iran to Britain, the United States, Australia, and West Germany. For a developing nation, the social and economic problems caused by such frequent earthquakes are even more enormous. It's impossible for the government to apply as much of its resources as it would like to the usual tasks of economic development or education, since the funds that are available are being continually diverted to emergency use. Even the health service is affected, since many of the quakes take place in remote mountainous areas, where during the winter the temperature falls way below freezing point, and during the summer it approaches a semi-tropical heat. Each quake brings with it the dangers of exposure and disease. One way and another, it seems as though Turkey's fated to face nature at its hardest and cruelest. Turkey's problem is that it lies where two of the major plates of the Earth's crust meet. This black line, running from the Bosphorus in the west right across to the eastern borders, marks the North Anatolian Fault, where the slowly moving plates grind against each other. And it's this movement of the Earth's crust that's responsible for the frequent earthquakes throughout the region. To tackle the problem of the quakes, or at least to try to study why and when they are likely to occur, the government's established a special earthquake research institute in Istanbul on the Bosphorus, at the western end of the fault. Special seismological machines have been installed to measure the movement of the Earth's crust as the two major plates that meet in this area slowly come together. It's thought that if the Earth's tension can be accurately measured and the timings and locations of earthquakes can be properly mapped, then it might be possible at a future date to predict where earthquakes will take place by watching for a build-up of pressure between the two plates of the Earth's crust. The Institute's computers measure the movement of the Earth in much the same way as a machine measures heartbeats, and their printouts of information provide most of the basic data from which the scientists hope to increase their knowledge of exactly what happens in earthquakes and what causes them. The field of seismological research still has a long way to go before it's uncovered all the answers, but the Turks, because they have to be, are well up in the field. One of the senior seismologists at the Institute is Dr. Tumer Alpazlan, who not only carries out his own studies, but also teaches research students. We asked him what were the main functions of the Institute.
Our main task is to install some seismograph stations along major risk zones and try to locate foreshocks of big, large, destructive earthquakes, if possible, and try to predict with some preliminary data, try to predict large earthquakes. Unfortunately, we don't have enough instruments to install all around Turkey, but all we do at the moment is do our best and try to locate some local shocks.
It will be at least 2 months before the immediate problems caused by the recent earthquake are solved. But what happens then?
Unfortunately, we don't have much to do in this position. What we can do, we can advise people to build their houses strongly and give them some advice and try to prepare for future shocks. And at this time, we are measuring locally period of ground and try to advise people that they have to build their houses according to this period of the ground motion.
Are you optimistic about the future of seismological research, and is enough money being spent on the problem?
As you know, our country has many problems. I'm sure that the government is spending as much money as she can. But at this moment, we don't have enough seismograph station to do anything against earthquakes. But I am sure that in the future, we will have more opportunity to say more about earthquakes, and earthquake prediction especially. To know earthquakes more, we must continue to support our Geophysical Department of universities to do more on the subject.
The areas that seem to be most affected by the country's frequent quakes are the rural areas, populated by farmers in small, traditionally minded communities. They've chosen to settle in them, despite the quakes, as they have done for thousands of years, because they're also the country's most fertile regions, providing much of its agricultural production. Because of the agricultural importance of the earthquake zones, there's not much the government can do to move people from them. Indeed, hydroelectric dams and heavy industry are now being situated there too. The government quite literally hasn't got any option. Most of the country is liable to suffer from earthquakes, and as many as 90% of the population live in danger zones. Most of the casualties in the quake are caused when their houses collapse. Especially in the more remote mountain areas, they are still built in the traditional style of stone, with dried mud for mortar. There's a shortage of concrete, strong enough to withstand at least the lesser quakes, and also of wood, which is flexible enough to give when the ground moves under it. This is Varto, site of the 1966 quake, as it is today. And it shows that the villagers, though they know the dangers, have rebuilt their houses in the same style as before. To a large extent, because of the building materials available, they haven't had any alternative. As well as studying the reasons for the earthquakes and trying to find how to predict them, Turkish scientists have turned their minds to ways of lessening the impact. Here at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, the nation's capital, special studies are being done in earthquake engineering to find out what kinds of structures are most likely to survive a quake. We asked Professor Polat Gulkan to outline the problem, but first to explain why so many casualties were caused.
Well, when you say casualties, of course you must differentiate between life loss and property loss. Now, it is true that earthquakes in Turkey cause more damage to buildings or construction than it would seem it does in other countries. The major reason for this is the admittedly poor quality of construction that we find in most areas of Turkey. The reason for this is that most dwellings, housing units, are built by people who actually live in these houses or by local masons, house builders, who live in the area. Now, these people have been following the same erroneous practices for centuries. In addition to this, the scarcity of timber, for example, especially in the eastern Turkey, contributes greatly to casualties in the case of earthquakes. The type of construction consists of heavy walls with heavy roofs with little natural resistance, and even in the case of a moderate earthquake, these construction units, dwelling units, collapse easily, trapping people and burying them underneath. What can be done about this problem? Well, I think the primary goal that we should adopt for ourselves should be the enforcement and the uniform enforcement of a qualified building code. Now, the statement might sound easy, but enforcing a building code like this is not an easy problem. You must reach the most remote areas, settlement areas, and educate these people as to how they should build their houses, so that they will have reasonably well resistance against earthquakes, and still be in conformity with the local climatic conditions, locally available construction materials, and so on. The problem is enormous, but I think it can be done.
The way of reducing casualties, according to the scientists in Ankara, is now clear. Persuade the farmers to live in more lightly built but still strong houses with tin roofs. And when a quake comes, if the new houses do collapse, they won't cause so much damage to anybody inside. It seems a simple enough solution, but what seems simple in Ankara doesn't look so good in Varto. A number of the new style houses were built after the 1966 quake, but they're by no means popular amongst the local residents. Part of the reason is a simple conservatism. The old houses have been good enough for generations, so they're good enough now, even if they do result in high casualties should a major quake hit the region. There's more to local opposition than simple conservatism, though. The new houses are small, and there's no room for the cattle, which traditionally sleep in a room adjoining the family. And with their tin roofs, they're hot in summer and cold in winter, failing to provide the insulation against the extremes of weather that is so badly needed. So the local farmers, quite simply, aren't using them. Some of the new houses aren't up to the job. They simply are not strong enough. One system that's been used is a modern version of wattle and daub, with a layer of mud and a layer of cow dung being plastered over a primitive framework of interwoven branches. Houses built this way are not only cold, but if they get wet or if they're struck, then they begin to disintegrate. Ankara's good ideas sometimes just aren't practical for day-to-day life in the mountain areas. The problems caused by Turkey's frequent earthquakes continue, despite the efforts now being made by the government. Seismological research is providing more and more knowledge about how quakes happen, but can't provide any hope of stopping them. Studies in earthquake engineering are suggesting new forms of construction more able to resist quakes, but these aren't always satisfactory for the people who have to live in them. Meanwhile, throughout Turkey, scenes like this occur almost every year. There's not always a disaster of the same proportions as the recent quake, but continual tremors shake the country, bringing down houses and forcing the people to live out in the open, even if they escape with their lives. It's been calculated it would cost over $2,500 to resettle one peasant family safely. With 3,000 villages at risk, the cost is clearly prohibitive. The future for the villagers of Turkey looks bleak. To wrest a living from the near barren hillsides is a task requiring incessant effort, and that merely to keep from starvation. And with its continual quakes, nature seems determined to take a steady toll of their lives in return.